Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, two former government ministers are warning they will quit the Conservative Party if the UK leaves the European Union without a deal, a day after three Tory backbenchers left the party to join the newly formed independent group, now made up of former members of Labour and the Conservatives. The 11 defectors say they expect more to join them in the coming days. Well, our chief political correspondent Vicky Young has more details.
There's a new team at Westminster and speculation that some more signings could be on the way. Brexit is part of the reason MPs have broken away from their own side to join an independent group in Parliament. One former Conservative cabinet minister says she couldn't stay in her party if there's a no-deal Brexit.
We're becoming a single-issue party that's consumed by Brexit. That's not a recipe for success. I think we need to wake up and smell the coffee now, because if we don't, then what we'll be looking at is a post-mortem on the Conservative Party.
Another colleague also campaigning against Brexit has similar worries.
I want to try to make my party act in the national interest. That's the thing on which I'm focused. If I were to get to a point where I felt my party was no longer doing that, then I would have to resign the whip.
These three MPs quit the Tory party yesterday, accusing the Prime Minister of a dismal failure to stand up to Eurosceptics. Theresa May wrote to them today rejecting their criticisms and insisting she led a modern, open-hearted party.
We're in a very serious time as we try to reach the end of getting the right outcome for the United Kingdom on leaving the European Union. So I hope we'll all be able to support the Prime Minister and get the deal through next week.
Theresa May has another deadline looming. Next week, some MPs are going to try to seize control of the Brexit process. They want to stop the UK leaving the EU without a deal. Ministers have threatened to resign over the matter, so there's even more pressure on the government to bring back its deal to Parliament as soon as possible.
Theresa May's been back in Brussels this week, desperate to get changes to the withdrawal agreement that will satisfy MPs back home. The Labour leader's been making his case to EU negotiators too.
The danger of a no-deal exit from the European Union for Britain is a very serious and very present one. We from the Labour Party have made it very clear that we do not countenance a no-deal exit because of the danger to jobs.
Senior European figures share those concerns.
My efforts are oriented in a way that the worst can be avoided. But I'm not very optimistic when it comes to this issue.
And was this a clue about the current mood in Brussels?
I have something like a Brexit fatigue, you know.
In the coming days, Theresa May is going to need the art of persuasion to convince the EU to budge.
Can the Prime Minister persuade you to stay?
And her unhappy MPs to stay. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
We don't need more time, we need decisions from the British Parliament. This from the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, who's just been holding talks with the Brexit Secretary, Stephen Barclay. The mood in Brussels growing distinctly gloomier about the prospects of no deal. Even the European Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, declared he had Brexit fatigue. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster. Gary.
Well, it was a day of defection watch, everybody looking around, wondering if someone else was going to splinter away from the two main parties. Well, it's 7 o'clock and nobody's done it yet. I do think there will be more, and all the indications are that they could come in, as a couple of people have used to me who are close to all of this, dollops. One of the other things that I think you could see, though, is some people doing stuff that isn't a full-blown defection, but which proves that the icebergs do have sort of fractures in them. So you can go a bit short of actually changing party. You could, for instance, do a statement of your own aims and values, or maybe even come together in a group and do that. Maybe even start commissioning policy in a group. And we could see things like that in the coming days and weeks. But the attention has been switching after 3 days of party realignment mania back to Brexit and the timetable. And the interesting thing there, the deadline that everybody's looking at in the short term is Wednesday of next week, when there'll be votes in the House of Commons, and ministers, 4 of them cabinet ministers, have told the Prime Minister that they intend to vote against the party line in those votes if they haven't had concrete proposals since then that put them off that. They're not, as I understand it, these 4 cabinet ministers and others threatening to resign. They're telling the Prime Minister, we intend to defy you, we dare you to sack us. The amendment they're focused on is the one which could extend the date for Brexit. Theresa May is very wary of that, so she faces a race against time, trying to somehow defuse this time bomb ahead of Wednesday. Here's how the day went here as the focus switched a bit back to Brexit. The government today confirmed that by the time these goods get to Japan, there could be no trade agreement in place between the two countries. Attempts to roll over the EU treaty if Britain leaves without a deal have formally failed. The government published a country-by-country update of the rollover deal's to-do list, showing that with 36 days to Brexit, work ongoing appears again and again. The Trade Secretary Liam Fox had promised 40 deals would be signed by Brexit Day. So far, the total is 7. After 3 days of political realignment on live TV, the focus has returned to how Theresa May wins Commons backing for her Brexit divorce deal. Some cabinet ministers, including Amber Rudd, have told the Prime Minister they may back attempts next week to force the government to ask for a delay on the Brexit date, in effect daring the Prime Minister to sack them. So Mrs May has limited time to head them off. The European Commission President said a no-deal Brexit was looking quite possible.
My efforts are oriented in a way that the worst can be avoided. But I'm not very optimistic when it comes to this issue.
What I would say is that the threat of no deal is something that has deeply exercised people throughout the European Union. They're very worried about the consequences of it, and that was conveyed to us in no uncertain terms during the meeting.
Okay, I think we're now...
Jeremy Corbyn had just been meeting EU negotiator Michel Barnier in Brussels. When it comes to Brexit-inspired party splits back home, Mr Corbyn and his top team seem to have taken a much more brittle approach to defectors than the shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. Mr McDonnell's been making personal approaches to hostile Labour MPs, offering himself up for constituency visits. Theresa May today replied to the 3 MPs who sent her a resignation letter yesterday. She said the Conservatives hadn't turned hard right as they had claimed. All 3 MPs said there'd been no attempt to get them to stay in the party. Today, Number 10 asked in some pro-Remain MPs who are on their resignation watch list. They didn't try that hard to hold on to some of the others, and they're going to try and grab you by the ankles. They're making more effort suddenly.
Well, I've been very happy to see the Prime Minister, and indeed wanting to see her for some time, because I've been increasingly concerned about the direction our party is taking.
When did they tell you would get that meeting?
Just earlier today.
She wasn't the only one called in. One other pro-Remain Tory was suddenly invited for a chat. After her meeting, it didn't sound like the charm offensive had worked on Justine Greening.
What did the Prime Minister have to say?
Was the Prime Minister receptive?
Well, we had a frank discussion, and I think that was important. That's what I've got to say. Thank you.
MPs who made the leap out of the 2 major parties this week are working on colleagues they left behind. Just about everyone in Westminster is banking on more following suit.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Labour MP Jess Phillips, who said she found it hard to disagree with her former colleagues who are part of the independent group, and I asked her whether she was minded to join them.
Anybody would find it hard to disagree with the stuff that was being said about anti-Semitism. Something has got to be done about it. I find it quite hard to disagree with some of the other things, not exclusively everything that they said. But what keeps me in the Labour Party is not what happens around Westminster. The Labour Party to me is all the people in my constituency party, all of my childhood, all of the activism for years and years. It is as much like my religion as religious people feel about their church.
But is there a red line at which you say, actually enough is enough? I mean, you quit the party over the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. If Jeremy Corbyn, for example, doesn't back the second referendum that the Kyle Amendment is proposing, is that a point at which you and others go, OK, enough's enough, I'm out?
I think that if Jeremy Corbyn doesn't make it very, very clear that a clear commitment to either a people's vote or the Kyle Amendment, which I think is a decent compromise, and follow what the membership of our party are telling us in really loud voice, then it's not necessarily my red line. My red line actually is Luciana's red line. My red line is the anti-Semitism. But I think that there's an opportunity for him, directly him, and it can't be done by other people around him, to really come out very, very strongly and say things like George Galloway would never be welcome in our party. To say things like what happened with the Labour Party students this week when they put Palestine Lives at the announcement of Joan Ryan leaving, that is anti-Semitic and it has to stop. I think Jeremy Corbyn, I would like to give him the chance to be really vocal and to stop feeling like he had to keep that constituency of the Labour Party happy and to show real strength. And if that doesn't happen, if people who write those sorts of things on Twitter, if people feel that they can still be part of the Labour Party, then that would absolutely be my red line. Brexit,
and you'd be out and joining the independent group?
Well, whether I join the independent group or I can't stand in an election for a party that I think is racist. And at the moment, I think that we have a chance to undo some of the terrible anti-Semitism that's been going on in the Labour Party, and I think it deserves a chance to get better, but its chances can run out.
You've said anti-Semitism is the reddest of your red lines, but for other people, you suggested that it might be the second referendum.
Yes, absolutely.
How confident are you that the leadership will back the Kyle Amendment, the second referendum amendment? And if they don't, what happens? How many people leave?
I think that the Kyle Amendment, the idea of backing a referendum on Theresa May's deal, is I feel confident that that is the position that we're going to take going forward in the Labour Party. I feel confident that over the next week the Labour Party will shift into a more a position that represents what its members want more.
Two-word answer on this one. Do you feel closer to Jeremy Corbyn or Luciana Berger?
I feel closer to Luciana Berger, without any shadow of a doubt.
It was more than 2 words, but it was an answer anyway. What about Anna Soubry or Jeremy Corbyn?
Oh, Jeremy Corbyn still, I think, although I really like Anna. She's a proper laugh.
Do you think that there will be many more defections?
I think there will be more. I find it difficult to put a number on it, though. I think there will be more defections from both parties.
Is the Labour Party finished?
I hope not. But unless it pulls its socks up, there's a real chance that it could be finished in a way that it was in the 80s and won't be able to bounce back for years at least.
Jess Phillips, thanks very much. A referendum on Europe which divided families, communities and politics, but the result was being challenged only a few years later. Politicians from different traditions coming together to create new parties and old parties being transformed by new leadership. A vision of the present and future or a description of Britain after 1975. Dr. Robert Saunders has written a history of that referendum and he joins me now. So what I want to know is the first referendum on Europe upended British politics, and this one has done too. Why is it that referenda have a habit of doing that?
I think referendums are extremely dangerous things for political parties. Ironically, they tend to happen, as in 1975 and 2016, because parties are very divided, and they see this as a way of holding their party together. But what they actually do is that they upend usual party allegiances, they get people used to working across party lines, and they really shift the axes of politics in a way that's very destructive for the established parties.
And how permanent is that shift, judging by past history?
I think it depends on whether or not the referendum puts a question to bed, or whether, as in 2016, in fact, you get an instruction from the electorate which then continues for years afterwards.
And the same thing happened in 1975. I mean, it didn't close the question of Europe, did it?
It didn't close the question, no. It tranquilised it very briefly, I think, but the big divides that underlay that referendum resonated right the way through into the 1980s and beyond.
And is that a particular function of referenda, do you think, that they don't resolve issues because it's a sort of binary question?
Well, I think there are two things that are really difficult about referendums for political parties. One is that parties are always coalitions, and in that sense, it makes sense for them to try to blur contentious issues, whereas what a referendum does is to polarise. It's leave or remain, it's independence or it's the union, it's yes or it's no. So that's a major problem. The other issue is that they tend to move the dividing lines in politics. If we think about a classic Tory-Labour split. It's about class and it's about how you manage the economy. Whereas what a referendum does is suddenly moves that 90 degrees and makes it about where do you stand on Europe. And suddenly that doesn't work with the established party lines. And suddenly you have Enoch Powell and Tony Benn on one side of the fence, you have Margaret Thatcher and Roy Jenkins on the other. And the way that people have thought about their political allegiances suddenly no longer fits with the most important question of British politics.
And so in 1975, I suppose you could say the fallout from the referendum paved the way for the SDP, and now you've got the independent group. Is that an apt parallel, or are there big differences?
I think history never repeats itself. Every circumstance is unique, but I think if you look at what's driving both these two splits, they have a tremendous amount in common. In both cases, you've got quite a significant public disengagement with the two major parties that's been building for some time. You've also got two parties that are moving towards their flanks and therefore leaving a large group in the centre that feels disenfranchised. And of course, in both cases, you've got Europe as the particular sort of sulphuric acid that's eating away at party alignment.
And the 1975 referendum, the SDP that then emerged, was a kind of short-lived phenomenon, really, wasn't it? Relatively speaking, I mean, it was 7 years it existed. How short-lived or not do you think the independent group will be? Or is it just too early to say?
Well, I think what's interesting about the SDP is that they clearly did speak to a demand in the public. If you look at the 1983 election, despite the pressure that first past the post puts on voters to back one of the big two, despite all the concerns about wasting your vote, 1 in 4 voters backed the SDP. So there clearly was a demand for them. The electoral system shut that out of Parliament, but there was a political space. Now, I think the question today is whether the electoral system will have that locking out effect again.
Well, why wouldn't it?
Well, I think it's partly about what happens to the other two parties. To what extent Brexit has actually broken their structural integrity. Even first past the post has a tipping point. There is a point at which it stops shutting out smaller parties. And I think if we get a situation in which both the Conservatives and Labour are pushing down in the high 20s, then suddenly the political possibilities change in a way that they didn't in the early 1980s.
History may not repeat itself in that.
It might not.
If you look at, just take the sort of long view, really historical, but step back. The UK's been a member of the EU, or the predecessor, for 46 years. Could that, in time, be seen as a sort of historical blip? And actually what we're seeing now is a return to normality?
I think it does give us a defined period of history, assuming that Brexit does happen. I don't think there's any way in which we can return to where we were in 1973, but I think we are going to move into something new. And I think the possibilities, therefore, for a new alignment of politics are higher than they were in the early 1980s.
Right. And just briefly, I mean, if the UK does go ahead and leave, who's got a plan for what Brexit looks like, in your view?
Well, I think there are, you might say that there's an abundance of plans of what Brexit might look like, and that's the difficulty, that really what's paralysing British politics right now is how do you get from the abstract proposition that we want to leave to the very concrete decision of what kind of relationship do we want to have in the future? And that's really what's tearing the parties apart.
We'll have you back in a few decades' time.
Thank you.
Dr. Robert Saunders, thank you very much.
To convince us all he has what it takes to become our next Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn, like all leaders of the opposition, needs, of course, to look the part. And today he was in Brussels discussing Brexit with the EU negotiator Michel Barnier. It is the big issue of our age, destined to go on forever. And he let us join him and his team on their trip there. But we also wanted to know about the big issue of the day, the fate of Shamima Begum, the British woman who married a fighter for so-called Islamic State. Mr. Corbyn was pretty clear on that. She should not lose her British citizenship, he said, and she should be allowed back here to the UK. As for Brexit and the rebels who've just walked out on his party, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly turning the other cheek.
Arriving in Brussels in a week when 8 of his MPs have decided to leave. Partly disillusioned with the party's Brexit policies, Jeremy Corbyn's leadership is under intense scrutiny. I followed the Labour leader's day as he arrived for talks with EU officials, but issues at home are never far away. The question on Shamina Begum as well. If you were Prime Minister, would you back the move to strip her of her UK citizenship?
No, because she was born in Britain. She has that right to remain in Britain, and obviously there are a lot of questions she has to answer. But I think the idea of stripping somebody of their citizenship when they were born in Britain is a very extreme manoeuvre.
Brexit no less divisive. But in the corridors of European power, Jeremy Corbyn believes Labour's Brexit vision of a customs union and close alignment with the single market is finding increasing favour in the face of no deal. Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, was, we're told, sympathetic to Labour's plans during today's meeting, but was described as agitated by the lack of a deal with the UK.
What I got from him was a very strong message that he's very worried about the danger of no deal.
Do you think it's likely there'll be a delay?
It's quite, I would have thought, because of the Prime Minister's dilatory behaviour on this and the way that she delayed putting her vote to Parliament in December, when she had already agreed with me that that would be the date that Parliament would vote. It didn't vote in December, and it voted more than 5 weeks later.
8 MPs left Labour this week. More may follow in their footsteps. Jeremy Corbyn told me their political journey could be a one-way ticket.
They've left the party, they've made their own decisions. I'm very unclear as to what policies they're putting forward.
Are they welcome back, ever?
If they apply to come back in the future, obviously we can look at it. But listen...
You don't sound very keen on them coming back.
They resigned from the party in a blaze of publicity, and I regret that.
Sounds like they're not welcome back at any time.
Let's see what happens and see how people go on.
Those who've left the party should stand down and face by-elections, insists Mr Corbyn. The deputy leader of the party, Tom Watson, called that knee-jerk and spiteful. What do you say to your own deputy leader?
I don't behave in a knee-jerk or spiteful way. I simply say that if you've been elected to Parliament on a manifesto for the many, not the few, which you were in the general election, and you then resign from the party and say you're doing something else because you're an individual who happens to be an MP, surely you owe something to the people that put you there.
Jeremy Corbyn, not the only party leader dealing with divisions in their ranks while trying to promote their vision of Brexit. Angus Walker, News at 10, Brussels.
Well, if Jeremy Corbyn is still playing hardball with the MPs who left his party, the walkout by 3 Conservatives yesterday seems to have unsettled the Prime Minister rather more. She invited 2 former ministers into Downing Street today to try and persuade them not to follow suit. One, the former Education Secretary, Justine Greening, said it was the first time she'd been asked in to see Mrs May for a year. And you might conclude from her demeanour afterwards that it'll be the last for a while too. For his part, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, told us he didn't know of any other Conservatives preparing to leave.
You worried about more people leaving the party, Chancellor?
Hard not to be when party divisions over Europe threaten to make the party split over Europe. So for the Tory High Command, today was all about damage limitation.
I very much hope that in time they will feel able to come back into the Conservative family, which is a very, very broad church, capable of accommodating a very wide range of views. But no, I don't know of anyone else that's contemplating this course of action.
But others were, among them Justine Greening, the former Education Secretary, who's horrified by talk of a no-deal Brexit, and this afternoon found herself suddenly invited into number 10 after months of not hearing from the Prime Minister.
What about a no-deal Brexit? Did you get any reassurance?
I was very clear with her that I think doing a no-deal Brexit would be bad for the country and bad for the party.
Was the Prime Minister receptive?
Well, we had a frank discussion, and I think that was important.
The 3 MPs who defected yesterday also received a letter from Theresa May. It rejected claims of entryism from the right. She said the party chairman and local associations must ensure that people who are joining our party support the values and objectives of the Conservative Party. She added, I was sorry to read and do not accept the parallel you draw with the way Jeremy Corbyn and the hard left have warped a once proud Labour Party. But ITV News has learned that 4 cabinet ministers warned Mrs May earlier this week that they could quit the government if she fails to rule out no deal. 5 other ministers also went to see her about their concerns. Today, one potential rebel said next week would be critical.
We're in a very serious time as we try to reach the end of getting the right outcome for the United Kingdom on leaving the European Union. So I hope we'll all be able to support the Prime Minister and get the deal through next week.
Meanwhile, one party grandee, never afraid to speak his mind, urged Mrs May to start listening to her pro-EU MPs.
I don't want to keep reading that we've lost more good people because we carry on with this absurd business of saying that Jacob Rees-Mogg has got to determine the shape of our deal with the European Union.
The question now whether Mrs May really can salvage her deal without causing a fatal split in her party.
And Libby is here to talk about all this. It's been a whole 24 hours without anyone leaving one of the major parties. Do we think there are more due? Are they going to leave soon?
Well, having spoken at length to Justine Greening today, I do think she is weighing up whether she has a future in the Conservative Party, not least because she is very concerned that it is becoming a single-issue party, that it's become known as the Brexit Party and stands for little else. And I think she was mainly talking to the Prime Minister about widening the party's agenda. She says she's staying for now, but I don't think it's guaranteed that she is going to stay forever. More worrying for the Prime Minister is not really what backbenchers are thinking of doing, but what her frontbenchers are thinking of doing. Because, as I was saying there, the fact is that at least 4 cabinet ministers have now threatened that they will resign unless next week she rules out no deal. Well, that could happen through this bill that's been put forward by Yvette Cooper and Nick Bowles, which would effectively instruct the government to ask for a delay in Article 15. We don't know what is going to happen to that. These cabinet ministers, I understand, are asking for a free vote on that. That means they could vote for that bill without actually leaving their positions in government. There are others pressing the Prime Minister to insist that it's whipped, and therefore these cabinet ministers would have to resign. I think the reality is that Theresa May is now facing a real moment of truth.
It would be quite a bizarre moment, wouldn't it, to have cabinet ministers voting for a bill to tell the cabinet what to do. Anyway, it's the world we live in. We will see. Thank you very much indeed.